Morning again, family. This morning I want to start my message by asking you to look at your neighbor and say, neighbor, I'm glad you're here today. And I'm glad all of you are here today. But see, that was kind of a setup because we're going to talk a little bit about the Good Samaritan from the Gospel of Luke today. In Luke 10, the question of who is my neighbor came up, and I wanted to see if you folks already knew so I would know how long I needed to preach today. I'm just kidding because you're going to listen to the whole thing anyway. We know I wrote this earlier in the week. However, I'm relieved to know that you have some idea who your neighbor is, but it's more than just who you're sitting next to or who you live next to. The Old Testament prophecies spoke of a Messiah that would come and establish a kingdom. The Jews assumed that this king, this Messiah, would come and establish an earthly kingdom to rule and conquer at will. Not so much. What they didn't expect was that when Jesus did come, he actually came to establish an eternal kingdom acquired by service and love. So Luke 10:25 starts with an expert in the law standing up to test Jesus. For some reason, our religious scholars love to try to test Jesus. Teacher, he said, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Jesus replied, what is written in the law? How do you read it? And the expert answered, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbors as yourself. This guy knows the Bible. He's hit the nail on the head. And Jesus said, you have given the right answer. Do this and you will live. But see, the expert wanted to justify himself. So he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? Now this seems like an unusual question to ask God. But maybe not so much unusual logically. If God tells us to do something, then it makes sense that we want to know how, right? So God, who is my neighbor? It's not unusual to ask for instruction or guidance. The thing that makes this question unusual is the expert's motivation. His enthusiasm is kind of twisted because Scripture says he wants to defend, to justify himself. This dude essentially is asking, how little can I love other people and still be okay with God? How little can I love other people and still be okay with God? How many of you have ever been at work on your lunch break and you don't really feel like talking that day? You know, you got things on your mind, and suddenly in comes Carl, the office extrovert. You're tired, but you know Carl wants to talk. Carl always wants to talk. And he's making eye contact. You're trying to avoid it by looking outside the window, pretending that the lizard on the bush is really interesting. You swipe your phone to Facebook, and suddenly you're thinking to yourself, God, what's the minimum amount I need to talk to Carl and still be okay with you? We get those kind of thoughts and about what is minimal you want me to do, Lord. And you know, this would never work in some circumstances. It would never work in marriage. Those of us who are married, we know, see the minimalist attitude, it's not going to work. Can you imagine asking how many times you have to put up with the other person first? To put the other person first? How many times you'd have to forgive them? To leave the toothpaste cap off? How many times you have to bring them flowers or do the laundry? This is just not going to work. It's not a minimalist attitude type of relationship. And what about parenting? Can you imagine asking, what's the least diapers I could change today? Or what's the least food I have to buy to feed these kids? These would really be strange questions. Yet it seems a lot of us slip into this way of thinking. We go into work like, do I really need to love these people? Maybe even here at church, there's someone who's strange to you. You don't really click with them, and you ask the Lord, Lord, what is it the least I have to do to love these people? Asking what the minimal love I have to give is an odd question to ask God. And the Lord responded with the story of the Good Samaritan. This parable relates to all kinds of people who are genuinely hurting and have a sincere need. When we think about our own needs, there should be no question to the fact that the most important need is spiritual. We need God more than anything. And all of our earthly needs are 70, 80, maybe 100 years at the most. But our need of God, His forgiveness, and to know His love is eternal. That's our most important need. God, His forgiveness, and His love. Yet we, as people, still have other needs. And a lot of ministries are only focused on souls, and they forget about the earthly needs that we have. But this story speaks to our earthly needs too, as well as how and who might be responsible for assisting God with caring for those needs. You got an idea who that might be? Who might just be responsible for assisting God in other people's earthly needs? If you don't, I'm telling you now, it's us. It's each other. It's people are here for people. Oh, he's lonely. Let's make a helpmate. Oh, this is very good. That's who might be responsible for helping God and assisting others in their earthly needs. As well as the fact that we know it's a sad reality that in today's world, it's not difficult to find people who are genuinely hurting and have a sincere need. It's a sad reality, but it's true. It's not hard. I'm genuinely hurting. I need those crutches. It's next to each of you. Everyone in this room is generally hurting in some form and has a sincere need that we can help with. And as we work through this parable today, I want you to think about which neighbor needs your help. Jesus continued with the story. We're waiting to see who's going to step up and help this man. Verse 31, now by chance, a priest was going down the road. Praise God, a church employee has shown up, but when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side of the road. So who's next? Likewise, a Levite. Hello, maybe some empathy here. That's like a deacon in the church. But when he came to the place and saw him, he too passed by on the other side of the road. Twice the same response to the wounded man. Jesus was pointing out religious hypocrisy. He pointed out leaders who dodged the need. There's something we must learn from, because a good excuse can lead to a wrong response. Now, I don't know the excuse of our religious leaders. I really don't. Maybe they thought of the law, and they're thinking that if they touched the man, they would become unclean, and they didn't want to be unclean. Maybe that's why. Maybe it was even fear. And there it is again, fear. I know God has something coming for you guys about fear, but maybe fear is a reality. Since the road was known as the Bloody Way, maybe they feared that it was a decoy to get robbed and beaten themselves, and so they kept going. Or maybe their schedule was filled up and they were already late to the next meeting. I really don't know their excuse, and I'm not going to judge them. But what we do know is their response to the situation. And passing by on the other side, dodging a need, was shown to us to be the wrong response. It's like we read in Scripture and forget it just a few minutes later. It's like we watch that beautiful inspirational television show and then forget everything a few minutes later. We need to step up, family. Will you also stay on the other side of the road when you see someone genuinely hurting and sincerely needing help? Which side will you choose? Will you have a good response to the call that's being placed in your life in that moment? See, no farmer sows his seed and goes out a week later expecting to see a mature crop. He knows that it takes time. And if he flew into a rage because the crop wasn't ready the next week, or if he grew discouraged and said, I'm giving up farming because it takes too long, we would say he's a foolish farmer. Farming is a slow process. But with the right response, the farmer works at it, and with God's rain eventually yields a harvest. That would be a right response. I know it went a little off here, but somehow this just came to me, so I was meant to share it with someone today. Thinking about right responses versus wrong responses. So thankfully, Jesus continued his story so that we might know the correct responses to things that come our way. Verses 33 and 35 said, but a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him. And remember, those were not the favorites of any class of citizens back then. But a Samaritan came while traveling, and when he saw him, the Samaritan, he was moved to pity. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. Then he put him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, "Take care of him, and when I come back, I will pay you for whatever you spend." Now I bet you're thinking, am I really supposed to help everyone like this? Gosh, that's hard. Is that really what I have to do to be right? No, family, not every need has your name on it. Remember a long time ago, we watched the video about the lady who went in and kept arguing in the mind with the Lord that she wanted to get this guy outside some chicken, but instead he told her to get peanut butter and all those things. And then she got outside, gave him the peanut butter, and the lady came behind her and gave him chicken. God doesn't call everyone to everything. He calls each of us to what He calls us to, and we have to answer that. He just doesn't call us to every need, but every need is fulfilled by each of those He calls if they answer. So furthermore, last week when I spoke about Paul's final instructions in 1 Thessalonians 5, Paul talked about a lot of followers being idle, extremely lazy, and not wanting to work. They just wanted to mooch off everybody else. And then in 2 Thessalonians 3, Paul went on to say, those who refuse to work will not eat. When we support people who are capable and refuse to work, we're enabling them, not helping them. And this is one big red stop sign we have in deciding who and when we are to respond to. So understand, yes, I'm telling you to answer your calls, but I'm also showing you some things that tell you this maybe is not the right way to answer. And another stop sign can be found in Proverbs 26:17. Like one who grabs a stray dog by the ears. Well, that doesn't sound like a what to do, does it? Like one who grabs a stray dog by the ears is someone who rushes into a quarrel that is not their own. Meddling in a disagreement that isn't your own isn't wise. We all know those who every time there's a disagreement, they just have to get in the middle of it. They automatically believe that it's their issue to solve and figure out. No, Scripture says we have restrictions when stepping into disagreements. And how about the really big stop sign that applies to scammers? See, those manipulative con artists. How many of you have had the emails or phone calls giving you some line about send us your info, we'll send you money, or the other 1 million scam likelies that they block on our phones now. And another limitation is that there's only 24 hours in a day. Physically, we get tired. We can't do everything. We can only do so much. We have specific roles, but we can't do everything. So God's not asking you to do the impossible. He's asking you to do the possible. He wants healthy boundaries, and that would make a good discussion group. However, today, Jesus is talking about how do we love our neighbor. What we can learn today from Jesus' story is first, this kind of love goes beyond good intentions. In James, we're told that faith by itself without action is dead. We have to move past good intentions. What's that mean? Well, let's look at James 1:27. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. In James 2:15-16, suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm and well fed. Is that some counterfeit religion or what? Go in peace, keep warm and well fed, but does nothing about their physical needs. What good is it? We have to move past good intentions. If you want to read a book about practical Christianity with a no-sense approach, it would be the book of James. That's what I'd tell you today. He talks about what it means to truly follow God and have a relationship with Him. But for now, let's stay back on our Good Samaritan and what we can learn from Jesus' story. And secondly, we learn that it can affect our schedules. The Samaritan takes time to use oil to soothe the wound, wine to disinfect it, time to bandage it. He took time. Time to do these things. Time to take the man to the inn where he wasn't even going. He goes out of his way for a man he doesn't even know. I've seen some other folks do that. I've seen somebody at this church who two strangers walked up walking or bicycling or something to Orlando, and they took them, told me, make sure I checked on them in an hour and a half, but took them, went out of their way in a place they weren't even going. And I know that some of you are like me with a tight schedule and to-do list, and that it can be dangerous because tight schedules and to-do lists Tight schedules can be dangerous, okay? And the reason for that is because sometimes when we're trying to keep our schedule, we miss our purpose. We need to leave our schedules less tight and more open, because we can become so focused on following our schedules that we miss our God-given purpose. And some of you know I'm really trying to work on that. When you've made appointments with me, I'll say 2-ish and I'll give you a call while I'm on my way. Does that work? Because I've learned that my 12-ish might run into the 2-ish, and you can't stop God's work. But if you look at Jesus' life in the gospel, you'll see he's always getting interrupted. Well, it looks like it's interrupted, but really there are great opportunities for ministry. Actually, some of the most important things Jesus did started with an interruption to his schedule. And we need to learn that we need to be a little more flexible with our schedules and not be so inflexible. We need to say, first thing in the mornings, God, what do you want me to do today? And truly loving people does impact our schedules. So the third thing Jesus shows us in this parable is that sometimes it costs us some money. The Samaritan paid for the room and the extra expenses. Compassion isn't cheap. The person who drove to Orlando spent a little gas money. We might have to open up our wallets on occasions. And finally, we see through the involvement with the innkeeper that we don't have to do these things alone. It's so much better when it's a team thing. This last week, I was in the office doing some work, and the bell rang. A man named Willie came in dripping with sweat and pulling his bag. His shirt was soaked. And I got Willie some water that some of you donated to the church. We got Willie some water. And we began to chat, Willie and I, about where he was coming from and where he was going. Willie had been dropped off the day before by his wife for a clinical trial that he couldn't do because when his lab work came back, he had a slight infection. But Willie's wife was at work and couldn't pick him up. Willie was walking to Kissimmee. Now I asked Willie if I could buy him a bus ticket to the most farthest, closest direction, that way to the Volusia County line. And he said no. Since Willie was insistent upon walking, I gave him some more water that you fine folks have donated, plus a few dollars from the benevolence fund that you fine folks donate. We helped Willie together. But this way he could stay hydrated along his way, because I'm thinking he's not getting there till August. Willie instead began to share his praises of God's work in his life, and he fought these tears in his eyes as he said, Pastor, I know you might think it's strange that I don't mind the walk, but you see, God has spared me through His grace 3 times. I've been bitten by a rattlesnake, I've been shot, and this last time I was mugged and beaten in Orlando at Celebration. I woke with a feeding tube in my mouth and my hands restrained. I was restrained because I couldn't walk, and the doctors didn't want me to get up and hurt myself. And when the doctors came in, he said, Willie, I hate to tell you this, but you're never going to walk again. Pastor, I remember trying to walk and falling down, but with a lot of faith, prayer, and God's grace, I can walk today. So you see, this walk might be an awful journey to some, but to me it's a blessing that I want to enjoy. I hugged Willie and he went on his way. We, all of you and I together, helped Willie that day. And of course, I have to be honest, I'm not sure Willie didn't help me more. The love of Jesus keeps trying to explain to us that this is how the kingdom works. It's a kingdom of love, and the kingdom is different. The kingdom love is different than the love of our society. See, society has conditions. Society gives a little, the minimum. We give when it's convenient or when we get something back. And Jesus says kingdom love is entirely different than the love of society. It's unconditional. And He proved that on the cross. The death and resurrection are the heart of our faith. It's sacrificial love. It was Jesus' passion. We often lose our passion for the kingdom because we misplace it in different worldly things, like sports or chocolate or fitness or one-night stands or drinking, you name it. But in this story, Jesus brings us back to loving other people. And hopefully at this point in his story, you're starting to pray in your minds, Jesus, change me, change my heart. I want to love people like you love. You know, the one thing we Floridians are familiar with is road construction. And on this road to Jericho, the Lord changed us, put us under construction, Lord. As we continue to pray in our minds today, Lord, change us, put us under construction. Change the way we travel the road. Change the way we respond to others. Look at these last two verses, 36 and 37. Which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? Pretty simple question, and the expert gets it right. He says, the one who showed him mercy. And Jesus said to him, go and do likewise. Our Samaritan's actions show us that he didn't care that he was seen as an enemy, an outcast. That everyone looked down on Samaritans. He was going to help someone no matter what, and that, my friends, is kingdom love. It's good to be reminded of this because sometimes we're hurting inside, feeling overlooked, and we can get angry because we're hurting and no one seems to care. We can get stuck in the me. But our Samaritan could have stayed bitter. And sometimes when we're hurting, the exact same thing that we need to do, the exact thing we need to do is to step out of our situation and go help someone else. So this is a great example of stepping out of our pity party that is shown to us in the Samaritan's parable. Jesus told the expert to go and do likewise. Jesus wants this kind of love to be ordinary, not exceptional. He wants it to be the standard operating procedure, not to be worn like a medal of honor, like you've done something special to earn it. It should be everyday behavior. So let's review quickly our cast of characters from this parable. We could be like the religious scholar who talks about loving other people but does nothing. Then there's the robbers who take advantage of the others, or the priest and the Levite who have all the answers but avoid loving the people. Or how about the innkeeper who loves, but only for what he's going to get in return? And lastly is our Samaritan, who loves and expects nothing in return. So today I'm going to leave you with this last question. Who are you in this story? Jesus isn't looking for one good Samaritan. He wants an army of good Samaritans. Amen?
Amen.